Hello everyone, this is a review of the 5th episode of the Orville, and by the way I made a mistake in my previous review. I said that Jonathan Frakes directed that episode, but he actually directed this one, Pria. And that chick from Prometheus guest starred in this episode, so I guess she survived LV-223. So she was great in this episode. Her character was kind of like the Vash of this TV series, I guess. If you remember Vash, she was like Picard's girlfriend, who was kind of a shady character, who was interested in profit, who was willing to do a lot of shady illegal stuff. She was always trying to smuggle artifacts to sell them and stuff like that. So it was totally against Picard's ideology, and yet they still had a thing going on. So it's very similar in this episode with this character. But before I get into spoilers, I just want to say that this series continues to impress me. There was not even one bad episode yet. Every single episode I like. And what surprises me most about this show is that they actually have a lot of science fiction stories and elements. And you know, I think that this show actually might even not just be on the same level as Star Trek, this might actually be better than Star Trek. And I'm not just talking about the current TV show. Even if you compare it to the older Star Trek shows, even to TNG, which was my favorite show, if you compare the Orville to the first season of TNG, TNG was much worse. Like, the first season has a lot of terrible episodes, really bad episodes, and yet on Orville there was not a bad episode yet. And so I dare say that it might even turn out to be better if it continues to be this good. And also the humor in this show gets better and better. There was one scene in particular in this episode which literally made me laugh like I didn't laugh in ages. Okay, so spoiler warning, and I will now dive into the actual plot. So they rescue Pria, who is kind of like the Vash of this TV series, and she and Captain Mercer has a sort of a romance, and they go into the holodeck. And this kind of reminds me of when Wesley took a date to the holodeck, like even some of the dialogue was the same. So anyway, this woman saves them from some dark matter storm, and it turns out that she's from the far future, and she actually saves them, and she's actually doing that because she wants to sell their ship as an old artifact. But you know, it's hard to even define her as a villain, because technically she saved their lives. She even says that they will be allowed to live in the 29th century, so in a way she's kind of like even a hero, you could say, because she's only doing that to people who are about to die anyway. She basically saves them in the last moment. She even said that she saved Amelia Earhart, who is a famous female pilot whose plane disappeared in the past, and I think Voyager even did an episode in which also they showed that someone saved her. So anyway, back to this show. So she says she's basically saving people in the last moment before they die, but she's kind of doing that for shady reasons, for profit. She just wants their vehicles and stuff. But if she actually saves people on the way, she's not actually a villain. She's not hurting anyone, on the contrary. There was a small B story with the robot Isaac, which really cracked me up. I totally love this part. And be warned again of spoilers. So basically Isaac is like Data, he doesn't understand humor, and they try to explain to him, and they try to explain what a prank is. And I knew right away that this will end badly, that he will do some bad prank. And it really reminds me of Data in the movie Generations, when Worf fell into the water and everybody laughed. He asked Beverly Crusher why it's so funny, and she tried to explain to him, and then he pushed her to the water. And then no one found it funny. And so I knew something like this would happen in this episode, and probably much worse, because this is a comedy, and because it's a comedy they allow themselves to go to extremes that Star Trek would never go to. And by the way, that's one of the reasons I love this show so much, and this is why I say it might even be better than Star Trek. Because in Star Trek I always felt that they are limiting themselves a little bit. They don't want to go too far into various places. For example, it was very rare to see exotic aliens on Star Trek. I think because they were afraid that it would look ridiculous, and so if they didn't have the budget to do it properly, they simply didn't do it. And so almost all the aliens were only humanoids, because I think they were afraid of being unintentional comedy. And yet in this show, because it's a comedy from the get-go, they are not afraid to really go to extremes, so they show a whole bunch of very strange aliens, like that gooey guy, who appeared again in this episode, by the way, and he shakes the hand of Pria with his tentacle, and we've seen 2 episodes ago what his tentacle actually is, and so this is really funny, I think. But anyway, back to Isaac. So as I said, this show allows itself the freedom, because it's a comedy, it's not afraid to really go to extremes. And so what they did with the prank that he pulled is something that we probably would never have seen in Star Trek. and it's kind of dark humor, and so I love it. I personally love dark humor. Those of you who know my old parodies, this is exactly the type of stuff I was editing. I was editing old episodes of Star Trek, remixing them to create new stories basically, and in a lot of them there was a lot of dark humor. And in a few of them I think like I edited Data to make him look like a sort of a psychopath, pulling very cruel pranks on everybody, like doing bodily harm to people. So we had the same exact kind of humor here, and so I totally loved it. I literally rolled on the floor, even though I knew it was coming. I knew what would happen because that's what I would do, and yet it was still really funny. So I totally loved it. I think this is the funniest moment on the show so far. Really going into that dark humor, but it's okay since it's a parody. And also, you know, Isaac doesn't seem like a psychopath because they literally like almost begged him to do that. The way they set up all that story, the way they showed him the surgery in the beginning. And so I don't think that even ruins his character. Like, he's still lovable. I don't think he's a psychopath. And you know, they show that they can easily regrow the limbs in this future, and so he simply goes to the med bay and regrows his leg, and so there's no actual harm done to anyone. And you know, this technology of regrowing limbs, I always kind of wondered why Star Trek doesn't have this technology. Like people who lost limbs, I think Nog in Deep Space Nine lost a leg, which, by the way, funny side note, Nog in Russian sounds very similar to a leg. And so that whole episode in Russian was kind of funny, I think. Like it sounded if you would say like Lego lost a leg, something like that. So it was really funny in Russian. Anyway, side note. So anyway, they gave him an artificial leg in that episode. So I always kind of wondered how come they don't have this ability in Star Trek. Also, I always wondered about Picard, who was, after he was assimilated, he had a hand again. And we know that the Borg cut off one hand and replaced it with a robotic hand. And yet Picard apparently didn't have his hand cut off, and it always kind of bugged me. And actually I think that was the original plan. I think I saw some schematics that Picard was actually supposed to lose his hand from the Borg and then later be replaced with an artificial hand which would have been whiter in color, similar to Data's skin, and that he would even put a black glove over that hand. So that would have been really cool actually. It's too bad they didn't do it. I think probably because they were afraid to be too similar to Star Wars. Maybe that's why they didn't do it. And so I guess it's implied that the Borg never actually cut off his hand, which is kind of strange, like why not? And so anyway, back to the show. So I love the fact that they have this ability, and it opens up a whole bunch of possibilities of bodily harm to the characters. And another interesting factoid in this episode, they actually stated that their top speed is 10 light years per hour, and it's actually really fast compared to Star Trek. You know, in Star Trek, Voyager was stuck on the other side of the galaxy, and it took them 70 years to get back home. And yet, with this speed, 10 light years per hour, I made a quick calculation, and I see that it will actually take them a little over a year to cross the galaxy from one side to the other. Since our galaxy is 100,000 light years, so it's pretty fast compared to Star Trek. So this is just an interesting side note. Also in this episode we got to see Alara's office, and we see a picture of a planet behind her, and I'm willing to bet that this is her planet. First of all, it looks pretty big. It looks almost like a gas giant in size, but with Earth-like features, so we know that her planet has very high gravity. Also, I forgot to mention in previous episodes when we saw the Bortis' quarters, we saw he has paintings of a kind of industrial zone, and we saw that even before we saw his planet. And when we saw his planet, that was actually exactly how it looked like. And that's kind of a funny, subtle humor in the background. Like you see him having all these pictures of his planet, which looks kind of ugly to us. It looks like an industrial zone. And so you kind of think like who would put such a view in his room of such an ugly place? And then we see his planet and we see that that's actually how his whole planet looks like. And so it makes perfect sense. And so I suspect that this planet behind Alara is actually her home planet. So back to the main plot. So she basically takes over the ship and takes them to the future. And we saw a whole bunch of very cool shots. And the wormhole looks spherical, which is, by the way, is how it's supposed to look like. So I love these special effects. Also, we had a bunch of interesting shots in the future. We saw something which might be a future villain even. But anyway, they managed to overpower her and take the ship back to the past. And this is where it gets interesting for me as a science fiction geek who loves to analyze science fiction stuff. So this will be an extreme geeky nitpick. So if you're not into that, then you can end the video here. If you're into all kinds of nitpicking and speculation of science fiction stuff, then you can stay. So Captain Mercer takes away her technology, and she actually had a mobile transporter. She could teleport herself wherever she wants. So he actually takes it away and puts it in his desk. And so I suspect that this is a setup for some future episode in which he will use it maybe. And this also reminds me of a bunch of stuff in Star Trek. Do you remember how the Doctor in Voyager got his mobile emitter? It was actually from some technology from centuries in the future, which he got to keep and use, and that's how he became mobile and could get out of the ship. So that reminds me of that. It also reminds me in Enterprise, Archer actually met a traveler from the future and ended up keeping all his gadgets from the future. He locked them in a room, but when he really needed them, then he came and got it. I think there was a device that allowed him to pass through walls and stuff like that. So I suspect the same thing will be with this device, with this teleporter device. Because he puts it in his desk, I guess it will be used in some future episode, possibly. And so keep this in mind. Secondly, he says that if he destroys the wormhole, then they will become safe from changes in the timeline. No one will try to take them away to the future. And so that's why he orders the wormhole to be destroyed. And this is where a lot of people, I think, got confused and didn't understand why she disappeared as a result. But I actually think it's kind of logical, because she said she was able to go back in time only thanks to this wormhole existing in the future. So if he destroyed it in the past, that means it doesn't exist in the future, and so she was not able to go back in time. And then she disappears, yet apparently everything up until that point didn't change. So it was as if she was there up until that moment. And so a lot of people, I think, have a logical problem with this, and time travel is always kind of illogical, but if you think about it, it could not have been any other way. Because if she was never there in the first place, then she never would have saved them from that black matter storm. And if she never saved them, then they wouldn't have destroyed the wormhole, and so she would be able to go back. And so the only way to solve it is to have her be in existence up until the point the wormhole was destroyed. And by the way, she was not actually erased from existence. She still exists in the future. It's just that she didn't come into the past. And it's as if the one we saw up until this point was kind of an alternate future version of her, which no longer exists, but she does exist as a person in the future, probably with no memories of all these events. And so technically it's possible that maybe we'll see her again if she finds some other way of time travel. She still exists in that future, she just lost her access to the past. And so for her, it's as if the wormhole never existed and she never traveled back in time, which technically means the Orville should be destroyed right now, but apparently the things that she changed up until that moment the wormhole were destroyed actually stayed the same as they were. And as for that little device that he took from her, technically if she disappeared, then it also should disappear. Now we never actually saw what happened to it because he put it in his desk, so possibly it also disappeared and then there was no actual problem, but I suspect that they are actually planning to use it later at some point. Maybe at some very tough situation, maybe he will really need a teleporter. And so how do you explain that? How do you explain that that device still exists if she disappeared? So I think there are two possible explanations. Number one, it's some kind of technobubble device which actually has temporal shielding, meaning it generates a shield which prevents it from being affected by the changes in the timeline. So if she was actually wearing that device when the wormhole was destroyed, she probably wouldn't have disappeared because it would have protected her. That's probably the reason that it has that feature. Because as a time traveler, she probably knows that changes in the past might affect her, and so to prevent that, that device probably also generates some kind of shields around her to protect her from changes in the timeline. So the device is not just a teleporter, but also has that other feature. It would only make sense, I think. And so because he took the device away from her, that's why it didn't protect her and she did disappear. But the device itself stayed safe. It probably has a shield around itself. And so that's one possible technobubble way to explain this, because it's simply shielded from changes in the timeline. And another way to explain why he would have the device is that maybe the device did disappear, but if they ever manage to reopen the wormhole in the future, leading back to the past, then immediately the device will appear again in his desk. And so if he ever encounters any more time travelers from that time period, maybe the device will reappear in his desk in the same place he left it, if that wormhole is ever reopened. And so that's another possible way to bring it back if they ever need it. And maybe it will never come back and then there is no problem at all. So anyway, it's always fun to speculate on this science fiction-y stuff. So let me know what you think about this in the comments below. I really wish to hear your theories. Do you think we'll see this device again? Do you think we'll ever see Pria again? I kind of suspect we will, because she does exist in the future and maybe she will find other ways to go back to the past. She probably won't have any memories of this encounter, but Ed will have memories of her. And so it's always fun to speculate and to debate all these topics. Let me know what you think and we can debate it in the comments. So that's it for now, and I will see you all next time.